Hello, welcome to the new edition of Turkey Talks. Today we have got a special guest, Outzen. Rich, welcome to join us. Thank you indeed for accepting our invitation at a short notice. And Kadir will be with us as well. Today we will be talking about President Erdogan's statement on Turkey's possible actions in Northern Syria against YPG and PYD terrorist forces. Recently, two Turkish members of the special forces were killed by PYD-YPG attack, and Erdogan has said that Turkey will not remain silent and will take some action. And we have seen in the Western media that Turkey is accused of escalating tensions, but Rich, you have already tweeted that people do not know how we come to this stage. What is the background as far as you can see?
Well, we have to take a look at not just the developments since Turkey became militarily involved in northern Syria with Euphrates Shield, and then later Olive Branch and Peace Spring. We have to look at the long history of the PKK and its affiliates working out of Syria, because these have shaped the security culture and the security apparatus's views of northern Syria as a threat. Americans and most Westerners typically don't understand Turkey's views on this, because they tend to see the YPG as a new phenomenon that rose in response to ISIS, and therefore as a positive phenomenon because they fought against ISIS. But that omits, of course, a massive amount of context that matters not just to Turkey, but to anyone who wants to understand how things happen. So you go back to the attacks out of the Amanos Mountains into Hatay that happened during the 2000s. You can go back to the 90s and Öcalan's presence first in the Bekaa and also in Damascus, and the fact that he was used essentially by Hafez al-Assad, Bashar's father, as an instrument, as a cat's paw, if you will, against Turkey. So there's a long history of PKK attacks being planned, supported, and organized from Syria, and attacks being launched into or supplies sent into Turkey from Syria. So it is not for nothing that Turkey has these concerns. So the sort of halt in Turkish operations that happened after sort of the chasing out of Öcalan from Syria ended sort of when the YPG became the dominant force in northern Syria. And this again followed sort of years of them being underground, because the Assad regime was oppressing Kurds more generally, and also was putting pressure on the PKK. So the PKK reflagged its Syrian operations as the YPG, with the political party as the PYD, and essentially made a truce with them when the Syrian revolution broke out. Why? Because both Assad and the YPG had bad relations or things to fear or enmity with the Syrian majority Sunni opposition, which of course is supported primarily by Turkey. So I think what we saw then is, as the peace process between Turkey and the PKK that was attempted, this Oslo process, as that also broke down in 2015, it coincided with the rise of U.S. support to the YPG in 2014. It's not a group we had supported. Actually, the U.S. is very anti-PKK in general at the political level, although we've never really pursued them in the 90s and the 2000s in a direct way. We provided general political support to Turkey. But the Syrian branch became useful to us because we had no other way of attacking ISIS. So we had this dilemma of the U.S. support to a proxy that pretended not to be PKK, pretended to be a new thing, and that for reasons of our own, we pretended to believe. And Turkey's patience was tested by this, because increasingly there was a resumption of attacks in Turkey. Up until 2015, it was actually quite a dangerous situation. The International Crisis Group statistics show that Turkey's effectiveness in counter-PKK operations after 2015 became very high. The sort of loss ratio of PKK fighters to Turkish security forces went from about 1.51, so 1.51 PKK killed for every casualty on the Turkish side in 2015, to over 5 and actually over 6 to 1. This is because Turkey developed drones, it developed better intelligence, and also because it started conducting operations across the border in Syria, as it had done in Iraq for some time. This, of course, created tension and stress between the United States, especially east of the Euphrates. I mean, the United States had no forces either in Afrin or near the Euphrates Shield area in northern Aleppo, but we did east of the Euphrates. So there was a big crisis in 2019 that was resolved by very careful diplomacy and resulted in a status quo that's more or less stable in the Peace Spring area. Now that the United States has sort of de-emphasized what we're doing in Syria, I mean, there's no top-level diplomacy being led, and returned to, under the Biden administration, something more of a modus vivendi approach with the Iranians and therefore with Assad, we see that there is an open question for Turkey. Turkey's long feared what it calls a terror corridor that would go all the way from the Iraqi border and really through northern Iraq to Kandil, all the way out to Afrin and potentially to the coast. They've broken up pieces of that, but there's a couple of places like Tel Rifat that is still, and Manbij as well, west of the Euphrates, and then Malakia, Darbassia, some of these other areas east of the Euphrates, that are still launching attacks or are the bases from which attacks are launched, both into Turkey itself. There's been hang gliders that attack into Hatay and things like that, as well as car bombs in Turkish-supported opposition areas such as Tel Abyad, Ras Al Ain, and Afrin itself. So the most recent attack that you alluded to against Turkish forces is, in my view, probably a retaliation attempt for Turkish drone strikes that have hit PKK leadership in the far depths of Iraq, up to 170 kilometers from the Iraq-Turkey border, and in Syria as well. They're acts of desperation on the part of the YPG, who clearly no longer has viable resistance, armed resistance options against the Turkish forces, so they resort to terror-type attacks. So to me, this is part of a long-running struggle between the PKK and its Syrian franchise and Turkey. And I think President Erdogan's remarks should be understood in that regard, that there is a provocation. The provocation is continued attacks via car bombs, rockets, missiles, and other types of attacks on the border and across the border.
As you have said, there is a obvious, I think, link and very strong evidence that the PKK and the YPG are the same. And I think even within the U.S. Circles and also in Europe, there is such a recognition as such. Therefore, Turkey, I think, will continue its efforts. But as you know, you were part of the, Syria team under the Trump administration, working with Jim Jeffrey. So you have a very, I think, comprehensive understanding and experience in the field as a military person and then as a political analyst. As you would remember, Operation Euphrates Shield, when that took place in 2016 and 17, US did not oppose it very strongly, at least. There was a tacit understanding that PYD and YPG would go to the eastern Euphrates, eastern Manbij. Whether that took place or not, this is something else. But today, when we look at the conditions, what would be the reaction, do you think, US will have if Turkey will strike or will have yet another operation in northern Syria against PYD and YPG?
It's a good question. And again, I'm not in government, so I can only speculate. I do think it's clear that there would be a different response depending on the location of any new operation. I think if it's west of the Euphrates, an area that the US has no military forces in and is not pursuing de-ISIS on the ground. I mean, there are occasionally drone strikes or airstrikes by American forces against ISIS targets and AQ targets in Idlib and places like that. But we have no ground forces, no permanent presence west of the Euphrates. So I think it would be a very limited response if there was an operation in, say, the Tel Rifat area. I think Turkey would have more to worry about from Russian response in either Tel Rifat or Manbij. That's not to say that there would not be voices pushing for sanctions or for some sort of, certainly condemnation. Expanded sanctions would be a possibility because in general, there in Washington, there is a suspicion and a disapproval of the Syrian opposition forces that Turkey partners with. And there is an inclination to think that the SDF, of which the YPG, of course, is the biggest part, that they are on the right side, that they're a force for stability, that they're anti-ISIS force, de-ISIS force. Because of the lack of context that we discussed earlier, the tendency in Washington is to see the SDF as the good guys. And because of that, any attack on them, even if the Americans aren't present, runs a risk of at least a rhetorical condemnation and possibly some further economic sanctions. Now, east of the Euphrates, if there were to be, so for instance, Kobani, which is a town of huge symbolic importance for Kurds, not just for the YPG, although it has a iconographical value for the PKK supporters as well. But further to the east towards the border with Iraq, again in Malakiya, Darbassia, there's Christians. There are small Christian communities that are of interest to Washington. And it's also very close to where we actually do have troops. So I think there would probably be a higher level reaction, more of a crisis environment that needed sort of a quick policy solution if there was an operation there. I think that would be more sensitive to the Americans. The American nightmare, so to speak, or at least for the policy people who follow this from the American side, is the crumbling of the SDF because of the fact that would, that they're sort of at the center of our de-ISIS campaign. And a lot of people dismiss the de-ISIS concerns and think that it's a maksat or that there's, some sort of a cover for us wanting to stay just for the oil or for other geopolitical reasons. But the truth is, ISIS is still very much a real concern for Washington. And it's been quiet, so the American people might think that it's less of a threat, but most Americans still are very interested in making sure ISIS is on the run and does not resurge. And for that, they consider SDF to be an important vehicle. So the key for Turkey to avoid a massive U.S. response or sort of a very angry response would be to carefully limit any operation to make sure that it does not run the risk of going into, I think Kobani, for instance, would be a mistake because of the massive Kurdish population and would get ugly and the threat of civilian deaths. So it would have to be in an area probably that was not as sensitive in the political sense, and also in one that did not threaten to actually collapse the entire SDF. A sort of a limited campaign for limited goals, a punitive campaign, if you will, by Turkey, probably runs a lower risk. None of this would be popular in Washington, but so that's sort of within those parameters, without large civilian loss of life and without actually collapsing the SDF, I think it would be a sort of a more symbolic than a painful response from Washington.
Kadir, if you would like to come in here, you would come in to ask question. Otherwise, I will ask yet another question to Rich.
I just wanted to say, Rich, I know we have to let you go in a couple minutes, but given your government experience, and Biden administration has promised a Syria policy, but that's been still kind of in the works, and we haven't heard much about the Syria policy of this administration. What do you think is the biggest hurdle that is before them right now in designing a policy that, that would make sense?
Well, I think the hurdles are that as a practical matter, we are very limited in how many forces we will deploy to Syria, and there's a real disinclination on the part of Americans to support any major new either diplomatic or military initiatives, because both of those take time and bandwidth and political capital. So I think we have very little to work. The team that's working on Syria within the administration has very few tools to employ. There's not going to be massive new sanctions. There's not going to be a massive new diplomatic effort to resolve the entire conflict. There's not going to be a massive new commitment of military resources. So that's an obstacle. The other aspect is maybe not an obstacle, but it's certainly a limiting factor, is that this administration clearly wants to return to sort of the Obama era approach to Iran, which is to try to get along with Iran. Getting along with Iran means not leading to the collapse of Assad. So there's the implication that it's going to be some version of a gradual de-escalation with the Assad regime and some sort of a legitimization or normalization at some point. There's many people in Washington, myself included, who are uncomfortable with that because it ignores the likely war crimes and certainly the massacres and the other sort of negative things that have been committed by the Assad regime. Over 500,000 people killed, over 10 million people driven from their homes, 6 million abroad, and at least 5 million internally displaced. The empowerment of sort of a narco economy and the extension of Iranian power, all these things are very troubling, and to simply accept those by normalizing is not something that the administration can publicly do. But there's this discussion of a power deal that you've seen, sort of Egyptian and Israeli gas creating electricity that would be flown or transferred from Jordan across Syria into Lebanon to help Lebanon. Looks a little bit and smells a little bit like a creeping normalization. So that principle of the sort of Biden team's foreign policy to make nice with Iran is an obstacle to doing anything substantive or solution-oriented in Syria. Certainly anything that protects the equities that Turkey and the United States have held as important up to this point. And the other thing is, frankly, we just don't, we've got Afghanistan, we've got the focus on great power competition with China and Taiwan, the Quad, India, Australia, these things that we're working on and trying to strengthen NATO. So Syria is a serious, serious afterthought. The low priority that it has for this administration and the fact that the administration has crises on the economy and immigration and COVID means that this is just not going to be a priority. And that's also a limiting factor.
Thank you.
Well,
I think I'll have to drop now, fellas, but excellent to talk with you, and I look forward to coming back in future.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, Rich. All the best. Okay, Kadir, now we are on our own to continue our discussion on the YPG-PYD challenge that Turkey faces in northern Syria. And I think as Rich Outzen, who has a broad experience in the field, has already said there's a background to all these, what we are going through, starting from the 1980s in Turkey, that Turkey has been facing this existential threat for decades. Now, some part of this threat moved to northern Syria. And also he said that the Western audience is not really aware of this sort of background. What other issues you can add to this reality that Rich already has said, but maybe you can expand on that? What are the major areas, major issues that the Western policymakers or the public are not aware of?
Yeah, as you remember, during the Trump administration, U.S. and Turkey had serious problems. There, Congress really went after Turkey for sort of, in their eyes, convincing Trump to pull out of Syria. And there was a lot of discussion saying that, Turks were going to be slaughtered by Turkey, and U.S. was abandoning their best allies on the ground, etc. But a lot of that political fighting was basically directed against Trump, and whoever seems to be getting along with Trump was also targeted. But what is not understood is in addition to what Rich said, the way that PKK runs things on the ground. We are used to their always creating these new entities, new branches under different disguises, and YPG is not an exception at all. So that YPG is their strategic play into Syria, and that's what they did, and they were able to get Western support for their actions. But the PKK has always also played with Iran and Russia, and there is, strong constituencies within the PKK that favors either Russia or China and Iran. That's always been the case, and that's not a new reality. So that's not well understood in the West either. How if the U.S. were to pull out and give up its support, PKK wouldn't lose any sleep over it and would simply switch to working with Russia and Iran or others. And the most recent attack, according to some analysts, may have been actually provoked partly, at least, or fully, we don't know, by Russia, who wants somehow a resolution in Idlib in favor of the Assad regime, which would produce millions of refugees, new refugees for Turkey, and it would make things much uglier than they already are. So these complexities are definitely not understood in the West, in Washington, except the few experts, let's say. But Congress, the media often will label it as quote-unquote Kurds, without understanding all these different groupings, including the Iraqi Kurdish parties like KDP, who are definitely having serious trouble with PKK for the past several decades. So I think the regional game that is being played by the PKK is not understood. What kind of an organization is this? That's not very understood. But the American military has sort of adopted a policy of working with them, legitimizing them and ignoring their connections to the PKK because they are on the ground able to fight ISIS as they would like, as the US would want. But at the same time, without the US support, US air support, their effectiveness would go down dramatically. And I think military experts understand this, but the general public or the media don't really understand this, and they think they're sort of the best fighters ever against ISIS, etc. So that remains a lingering problem, and it has an impact on the US-Turkey relationship.
Kadir, to me, actually, to say that US administration does not understand the reality on the ground, that would be quite naive, actually. That would be not persuading the Turkish public opinion, at least, because PKK's relations and PKK's influence on PYD and YPG, this is very clear. I mean, it is very obvious. And
CIA accepts that, and,
right.
And officials actually in their presentations to Congress said that. What I was trying to describe is the media and the Congress, most congressional members, senators even, don't necessarily understand the complexities on the ground.
Okay, on that point, I just would like to push you to answer the following question. When Turkey proposed to fight against ISIS with US instead of PYD, YPG, there was not a positive response from the US side. Now, US is presenting PYD, YPG and STF as heroes of the Kurdish people, or as the only representative. And now Turkey, if Turkey says, now we are NATO members, we are allies, and we would like to fill the gap in this region and fight against ISIS, what would be the reaction of the US administration, do you think?
Well, Talip Hocam, if you remember, Turkey presented a concrete proposal before the Raqqa operation. CENTCOM was planning to sort of clear ISIS forces from Raqqa, and they had decided that they would go in with YPG. And Turkey at that point presented a plan to actually have Syrian opposition groups to fight with the Turks, with the Americans together and take over Raqqa and establish stability. But CENTCOM's influence was very strong at that point, and they had already made plans. In their mind, they didn't think Syrian opposition groups could deliver this, but they created a situation by throwing their support behind YPG. They basically created a center of gravity around the YPG. So many Syrian opposition groups who would have probably united couldn't unite, and we have the situation right now. And this was done at the expense of the relationship between two NATO allies, as you said. I want to ask you a question. We haven't let you talk today, Professor Küçükcan. Of course, you're in Turkey, and when Turkey is controlling several areas in northern Syria militarily, and Turkish military servicemen faces danger there, to be able to, establish some sort of stability and prevent the creation of new refugees. And these kind of attacks happen by groups who are supposedly fighting ISIS alongside the Americans. How does the public see this, and what is the political impact of it among Turkish public? You feel it there, so why don't you kind of talk about that a little bit?
I think Turkish public opinion is very much concerned with what has happened and what might happen, of course, in the northern part of Syria, because Turkey has a long border with Syria, almost more than 900 kilometers. And of course, although Turkey controls the border very carefully, still we are talking about a large territory over which Turkey doesn't have 100% control, especially on the northern side of Syria. And also, as you have just mentioned, there is one issue that I think the world community or international community ignores to see, that the possible migration wave that might come to Turkey out of a, another instability and civil war in Syria. The current situation is very fragile, everybody knows that, and of course including Idlib, which is quite near to Turkey, and millions of people are just stuck in that city, and the regime has been just bombing some areas and pushing people out of the city. So this is the context in which Turkish public opinion and the Turkish people, Turkish media and Turkish politicians are really observing the situation. And of course, Turkey does not accept existence of a terror corridor in the northern part of Turkey, because this will be existential threat to the national security of the country, national security of its citizens. I think wherever you look at in the world, it is the, I think, legitimate right of each and every state to protect their citizens, to protect their borders and their national interests. That's what Turkey has been doing, but it's been described by the Western media and by the European media and by some intellectuals, academics, as if Turkey has been attacking Kurds in northern Syria. This is not the case. This is not how it is seen from Turkey, because Turkey has been hosting millions of refugees from Syria, and there is a potential, again, that many other people might come to Turkey. Therefore, Turkey will not accept such things. Yes, of course, as Rich has said, US might show some strong reactions if Turkey acts to eliminate some forces over there which are against Turkey, which are actually not against Turkey, but against the Turks, Kurds, and also the Arabs themselves, because we are talking about instability that is creating a lot of problems and a fruitful, let's say, ground on which non-state actors might emerge. Not only PYD, YPG, and SDF, but some others also might emerge there, and they will be also a danger to Syria and Turkey. Turkey has always argued that Turkey is supporting the integration of the state, and Turkey does not want any new and emerging state over there, because these will not be the states actually. Therefore, territorial integrity of Syria is important, and in order to protect that, Turkey will, of course, will try to eliminate or neutralize forces that are against Turkey's interests, especially the military personnel over there. Therefore, no matter which country reacts to Turkey's, I think, possible actions, as President Erdogan has very briefly alluded to, and also Defense Minister has already said the same thing, made a statement that Turkey will not allow terrorist attacks coming from other countries to Turkey, because this cannot be acceptable. And there is a strong Turkish public opinion supporting such sort of activities. Both, there were three major operations before. These were Operation Euphrates Shield, Operation Olive Branch, and lastly Operation Springfield, and there were support by the Turkish people because of the reasons that I have explained. But let me return you with a question, Kadir. Turkey now is much more self-confident and self-sufficient in that region, because it's been combating terrorists for many years and making operations across the border. Now, of course, Turkey needed a lot of technical and military help from its allies before. But as it's been alluded in our conversation earlier today, Turkey has its own capacity today. How do you think that Turkey has its own capacity, and how the US experts look at this, whether Turkey is able to conduct such operation on its own without the help of its allies?
Well, as you mentioned, Turkey has already done that since 2016. It has conducted 3 major operations. It controls 3 major areas, and these were first kind of unilateral, direct interventions by Turkey into Syria. Prior to that, Turkey had always advocated for a coalition, including the United States, to intervene in Syria and establish safe zones and safe areas, no-fly zones, but this obviously hasn't worked out, and we don't want to get into that story. That's very long, but since 2016, Turkey said, I am now going to protect my own national interests. Especially NATO allies had pulled out the Patriots, from the Turkish border, so Turkey felt even more insecure at that point. But Turkey feels much more confident to do it on its own, with its own capacity. And don't forget, there's been a lot of drone capacity in recent years that has been built up and has been successfully deployed in the region. And we shouldn't also forget that Turkish operations against the PKK inside Turkey, on the Turkish side of the border, has been also very strong and powerful, and PKK has been under a lot of pressure inside Turkey. So that's why part of the reason why YPG might be harassing Turkish forces and Turkish presence in northern Syria is because they can't do much inside Turkey, and they might be getting some cues from Russia to make things more difficult for Turkey in Idlib region. But Turkey is showing that it's ready to double down, and it will do it without allies, just like it has done in the past. So I'm not sure, maybe you would have a sense about this, but I'm not sure if an operation is necessarily imminent. It's never, we can't be 100% sure it's definitely going to happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Turkish presence is increased with additional troops, because part of what Assad regime wants, part of the reason why they won't come to the table is because they want some sort of victory in Idlib. They want the regime, Russia wants the regime to come to table having won, quote unquote, this war. So that's why they're making things difficult for Turkey, so that Turkey will eventually get out of Idlib region. But as you and I said, there's a lot at stake there, because millions of more refugees is something Turkey cannot handle. So expanding the military presence right now would actually preempt some of the humanitarian things that Turkey would have to do in the case of such, flood of refugees from Turkey, from Syria. So
Kadir, relative, even if it is relative in terms of stability, that's important for Turkey for two reasons. As you have said, Turkey will protect its national interests and national security. Secondly, there is one more thing that we have not, I think, time to talk about, that the return of refugees in those areas where Turkey had operations, okay? Until now, almost 450,000 people, Syrian people, went back to Syria, to their motherland, to their land where they were born and brought up. I think this is another aspect of the operations that we need to see, humanitarian aspect of the operation. As we have said, of course, Turkey will not go along with the provocations of PYD and YPG and to come head-to-head with Russia or other forces in the region. But I think Turkey has made that statement because Turkey is committed to the stability of Syria, especially in the northern part of it, and Turkey will continue its humanitarian efforts in the region. And also, I think this is also quite an important thing, Turkey is capable of doing it. It does not necessarily mean that that will happen tomorrow, but if Turkey sees it necessary, if it is in the interest of Turkey, if it is inevitable, then Turkey will go ahead. As I said, there's a strong public support behind such initiatives as we have seen in Turkey. Kadir, there are a lot of issues we need to talk about when it comes to Syria, but we come to the end of this edition today. Thank you very much for your comments, and I also would like to thank again Rich Outzen for his contribution to our edition. And until next time, we would like to say goodbye to everyone.
Thank you, Talip Hocam. Thanks for watching us.